Not to take away from the fact that I enjoyed my scream.
Curious because I would be saying, Janov did this, what do you think, Oh, you're criticizing him already. I mean, he's okay.
No, because already she saw through him. The very fact that he came to us because we were famous took away from his therapy right away. But my instinct was telling me that as he walked through the door looking like Jeff Chandler. Any guy who's selling the truth, which is what he was selling, and cure for neurosis, which is what I had and still have. But I know, whatever, we'll leave it at that. Yeah. I thought, why is he looking like Jeff Chandler from the profile on the back of the book? Why isn't he looking right at us? Why can't we look him in the eye? Those details are important, how he saw his image. And then the fact that he came all the way to England meant that he treated us different from his other patients, although he spent the 6 months telling all the other patients that he doesn't treat us any different. Till one day I got the courage to say to Daddy, well, you fucking well came all the way to England if you're trying to treat us because one day they brought cameras into one of the sessions and we just walked out the room, because even under Daddy I'm not going to be filmed, especially rolling around on the floor screaming. It looks silly, that's all. I like to perform, but I don't like to shit in public. So then he started berating us. Some people think they're so big that we're not filming them, we just happen to be filming the session. Who are you kidding, Mr. Janov? You happen to be filming the session with John Lennon and Yoko Ono in it. That's the difference. We're not doing anything special because you're here. You ain't? You didn't get on the plane and jump over and leave everything to come and cure us, right? Because that would have been a big scoop, the same as Maharishi Blue is cool, too. So what happens to the daddies that get famous people is the famous people either succumb completely to the daddy and then they promote the daddy. We're like catalysts, either the Beatles or John and Yoko, catalysts. The daddy always blows their cool because they can't contain that eagerness for power and glory. You see, and it always shows itself. It showed itself in Maharishi, it showed itself in Janov. And not that now looking back, at first I was bitter about Maharishi being human and a little bitter about Janov being human. Well, I'm not bitter about them being human. They're human. I'm only thinking what a dummy I am, Although I meditate and I cry. So I cannot deny it. Yeah. Glass onion. John Lennon.
Hello everybody and welcome to episode 88 of Glass Onion on John Lennon, and this is now part 2 of 3 of All We Are Saying, the John Lennon 1980 Playboy Interviews. In the last episode I said it was part 1 of 2, but wouldn't you know it, I've had to extend it because I'm adding another segment here that I stumbled across recently. But that's how this goes, and that's how my mind tends to work. Basically, last Sunday morning I found myself flicking through Coleman and Goldman, as you do. What could be better on a Sunday morning than flicking through those 2 books? The 2 books actually sit proudly side by side on my bookshelf. It's the book equivalent of having a family photo with a goody-goody favourite son standing next to the errant black sheep of the family. And in fact, considering the hate I've seen on some forums where I've tried to slightly defend that book, and that hate is probably from people who've never actually read it because they're too disgusted at the idea of it. Hush, hush, don't say that too loud. Goldman probably sits just slightly higher than Mark Chapman in some Beatles fans' estimations. But I was prompted by a couple of things. Some of you may know, if you follow Life and Life Only, I'm something of a scholar of the 10 Rillington Place crime story from the 1940s and 50s in England. Very, very gruesome, but fascinating on many levels. And I recently reread a book called The Two Killers of 10 Rillington Place by John Eddowes. And this is the Goldman to Ludovic Kennedy's Coleman. The most high-profile book about the case is Ludovic Kennedy's book called 10 Rillington Place, and it's the standard version now. It's quite unusual because it's the standard version that makes the establishment look bad. Anyway, there's a sort of Rillington Place continuum somewhere between Kennedy and Eddowes. And then, as we've also discussed on Life and Life Only, there's a mainstream to conspiracy continuum in terms of how the world works. I won't go into all that because I've already got plenty to talk about. In addition to that, This is where the time warp gets a bit weird. As I'm recording this now, I've already recorded 4 or 5 hours, I can't remember what it was in the end, with David Ghosty Wills on John Lennon in 1962. And without giving too much away, we were talking about when Stuart Sutcliffe died in April 62 and John Lennon's reaction, and how you'll hear about different reactions. And I jokingly said, I wonder what Goldman said about it. And we didn't check at the time. I made a joke about Goldman probably had John Lennon goose-stepping around Hamburg airport and punching the air, celebrating Stu's death. We were only joking, obviously, and we weren't making fun of Stu's death at all. But it got me thinking about an idea to do some direct comparison between Coleman and Goldman on the same events. So I've got a few of those here. I'm going to be reading quite a bit from both books, so we could be here a while. But if you're anything like as interested as I am in this continuum of competing narratives, then I think you'll enjoy it. And James Corbett, if you're listening, former guest of the show, he read Goldman for the first time while on a break. Doesn't sound like great holiday reading to me, but I think James enjoyed it, found it very thought-provoking, as it is. So if you can get through the don't character assassinate our John kind of feeling about it, it is worth a read. Perhaps to skim through rather than read the whole thing, particularly if you've already read it. Anyway, that's up to you. So let's get reading a bit of this. So the first bit is about Hamburg and the Beatles' relationships with the Fräuleins of the Reaper Barn. This is Astrid talking. She's talking about pet pills, first of all, and she said, we had maybe 1.5 for the whole night that would last for 7 or 8 hours, and she talks about these, what Mark Lewison called the Prelly chats, where you'd really get to know someone well after you took these pills. But reading just after that, Beatles mythology says that the 5 young men on their Hamburg trip wallowed in a sea of orgies and carried on as depraved sex maniacs, drug addicts and alcoholics. John, Paul, George, Stuart and Pete have been painted as 5 Liverpool louts rampaging through the Reaper Barn red light district, high on pet pills, using prostitutes all the time. Astrid, who was closer to the group than anyone, says adamantly that the stories are inaccurate and have grown over the years into sheer fantasy. Prostitutes, she laughs. First, they were too frightened to go anywhere near them, and secondly, they didn't have the money. Thirdly, and most importantly, they didn't need them. There were girls in the club sitting around waiting for John or Paul or George to go and sleep with them, but there were no sexual orgies. They all had their little affairs in Hamburg, but in 1960 even teenagers had a totally different sexual attitude towards one another. The girls were not prostitutes, they were 17 or 18 years old, and officially couldn't get into the club until they were 18. They were salesgirls or workers or students like me. And just the next line, the Beatles were 5 sweet, innocent young men, and they couldn't believe girls were falling in love with them. Yes, they had the occasional affairs, but definitely there was nothing wild about their behaviour. Well, Astrid was there. She was the, as George might say. I don't know. There's so much evidence to the contrary. I get the feeling with Astrid, and this is just speculation on my part, she seemed to feel protective towards them, even though she was probably, a couple of years older than them. And particularly George, she always talked about little George. And I think there may be a little bit of that involved. Maybe they were afraid of prostitutes, I don't know, but when drink is involved and you're in the midst of rock and roll, I don't know. I think there's a grey area, Paul mentioned, I think, strippers, which is obviously not quite the same as prostitutes. Let's not go down that road, you know what I'm talking about. That just sounds very innocent to me. So let's get the other version. Now, this is not just about women, but notice as well, the style of writing is completely different. And I'm not saying one is better than the other. When Erin Torkelson-Weber was on, she basically concluded that historiographically, that is a word, isn't it? Still struggling with that word 2 years after I spoke to Erin. She said basically the 2 books were as bad as each other in terms of errors. So here we go. This is from Goldman. So he talks about Stu staying with Astrid and then says, the other Beatles were also occupied with women at Hamburg, but their sex life could be summed up in one word, orgy. Isn't that interesting that the Coleman book takes pains to say that there weren't orgies? Lodged in a couple of unlit cubicles at the back of the Bambikino, a cheap movie house near the Indra, the Beatles had fallen into the habit of having a ball every night after work. Pete Best describes how the boys would return to their digs at 2 or 3 in the morning to be greeted by the smell of perfume in the dark and the giggling of invisible girls. Often without seeing the girls, the Beatles would begin their nightly romp. There were usually 5 or 6 girls between us, recalled Best, During the proceedings there would come an echoing cry from John or George along the corridor, inquiring of Paul and me, "How's yours going? I'm just finishing. How about swapping over?" Or, "How are you two doing? I fancy one of yours now." On the most memorable night, the Beatles had 8 girls and contrived to screw them each twice. All this from a band that subsequently got famous singing "I Want to Hold Your Hand." Yeah, I don't know, 8 girls, screwing them each twice. Well, Jimmy Nichols said, he was quite sexually charged, but keeping up with the Beatles was difficult, so all right, fair enough. Once a game of bedding the Beatles became popular in the red light district, it assumed a variety of forms. Prostitutes who worked in houses would invite the boys to spend an evening for free. Exuberant hookers would jump to their feet at the Kaiserkeller and hold up their arms in the "fuck you" gesture, shouting "Gazunka." Jaded whores would sit coolly at tables near the stage and indicate by wink or nod that they wanted to get it on with the boys. John got the clap, but as he told a friend, 1 shot in the butt and it was gone. So, just the writing and the content, you can see the enormous contrast. They probably did get quite a lot of sex for free, so that would answer the question of Astrid saying they couldn't afford it. They were also earning quite well. They were rocking out for a lot of hours. And then he talks about drink, but I wanted to get to another part, which is not about girls, but it's another one of the allegations that has been, I guess refuted by some people. As a bitterly cold and dreary winter of North Germany came on, with the icy wind off the North Sea digging its talons into the thinly clad Beatles, the boys began to hurt. They needed cash to buy warm clothes and nourishing food. For a young man like John Lennon, who'd always been a hitter and who had long entertained criminal fancies, the solution was obvious. Time and again John had seen waiters taking money out of the pockets of drunken sailors. Why shouldn't the Beatles turn the same trick? One night a beefy German sailor who'd been plying the Beatles with drink during their show bought the boys a meal. Riveted by the size of the sailor's wallet, the Beatles decided on the spur of the moment to roll him. When they hit the street, however, George and Paul chickened out. That left John and Pete to make the attempt. The 2 toughest Beatles jumped the German in a parking lot. John smashed the sailor in the face, dropping him to his knees. Pete dove for the man's wallet. The sailor was a strong man. Even as Pete fumbled for the wallet, the German regained his feet and knocked Lennon to the ground. Then he thrust his hand into the back of his pants and pulled out a gun. There was no telling from the look of the gun whether it shot bullets or tear gas. Frantically, both boys pitched themselves head first at the burly German, toppling him while he fired wildly over their heads. John and Pete then beat their man until they were sure they could make their escape, racing up the dark street with their eyes smarting from tear gas. After running 3 miles, John and Pete staggered breathless into their quarters at the Bambikino. Paul and George were waiting up. "What'd you get?" barked George from his bed. "Not a bloody penny," gasped Lennon. So they'd lost the wallet. Paul and George burst out in derisive laughter. And then after that they were worried that the guy might recognise them, come back. John Lennon disclosed in 1974, in the course of a conversation with his favourite guitarist and hangout buddy Jesse Ed Davis, that this mugging was not an isolated act, but one of a number of such adventures in which John had been involved. His victims had not been Germans, but English sailors, whom he chose to make it appear that they'd been attacked by nasty Germans. One attack lay heavy on his conscience because he'd gone mad and beaten the sailor so badly that John feared he'd left the man dead. Lennon's language was roughly, "God knows if he ever got up again." So, the truth is probably in the middle. I reckon they rolled 2 or 3. I don't know. It's probably better if I don't give my opinion on stuff that I really have no idea about. There's other comparisons I'll come to in a sec where I do have a bit more of an idea. But there you go. The next one is about Stuart's death. So from Coleman, this is just after Stu's died. Astrid went from the hospital to Hamburg airport to meet John, Paul and Pete Best. They knew nothing of the drama of the day, still less of 21-year-old Stuart's death. "I don't know how I got through that moment after what happened," says Astrid. "I can see John walking into the airport hall, and he got sight of me and came over, waving his arms. 'Hello, I'm here. How are you?' 'Oh, what's the matter?' He could see darkness in Astrid's doleful, expressive eyes. 'Stuart died, John. He's gone.' Lennon's reaction was to burst into laughter. He said nothing at all to anyone. He never cried, says Astrid, not once. He went into this hysterical laughter and couldn't stop. It was his way of not wanting to face the truth. John went deep into himself for just a little while after the news, but he and I didn't speak much about Stuart. I knew that he and Stuart genuinely loved each other. And then just going forward to the next paragraph, Leonard's method of recovery was the same that he had adopted when first he had that awful choice between his mother and father, then the death of Uncle George, then the death of his mother. His period of mourning was quiet, totally personal, and not shared with anyone else. He believed in getting on with living immediately. I think we have it on fairly good authority that when Uncle George died, him and his cousin Layla went up to his room or her room and laughed, clearly as a defence thing. But his period of mourning was quiet. I mean, that's absolutely not true after the death of his mother. You know, many testimonies, Pete Shotton and others have said, you know, he went wild after that and was drinking very heavily. And we know what happens when John Lennon drinks heavily. So this thing about getting on with living, I won't tell you now, but Ghosty and I talked about that. And, you know, this thing about John saying to Astrid, you know, you've got to get on with your life. I feel like John was probably one of those people that's very good at giving other people advice, but not very good at following it himself. And I'd probably put myself in that category as well. So this is Goldman on the same incident. The fifth Beatle had died in a coma the day before as he was being rushed to the hospital. Stewart must have got out of bed during the night, recounted Astrid. I found him collapsed on the floor and called an ambulance. With the driver, I helped to carry him down 3 flights of stairs. As we raced to the hospital, he became very white and drawn. He was on a stretcher in the hospital lift when a doctor looked down at him and announced that he was dead. They said he had a clot of blood on the brain. I just sat in the hospital for hours staring at the wall. I felt as though my whole life had been taken away from me. So we've obviously backtracked a bit. We're talking about when it actually happened. John became hysterical. He wept like a child, recalled Pete Best, adding, I had never seen him break down in public before. He was absolutely shattered. John could be the hard man, violent and abrasive, but the tragic news that came from Astrid's pale lips utterly floored him. So like I say, Ghosty and I go into that a lot more, so I'll leave it there. But again, we're getting grains of truth or grains of agreement in that Pete Best said I'd never seen him break down, and then Astrid says that he never broke down ever, so make of that what you will. Right, now we're jumping forward a few years to roughly, I think, 1967, maybe 68. And on the subject of John's infidelities and how he broke the news to Cynthia, I mean, this is absolutely incredible. Listen to this. So, from Coleman, honesty, one of John's most endearing characteristics, forced him to confess to Cynthia one day early in 1967. So Coleman's got it as 67 and Goldman's got it a year later, as we'll hear in a minute. Cynthia was washing the dishes when John came behind her, put his arms around her waist and said, I want to get it off my chest, Cyn. There've been hundreds of other women. It could have been an explosive moment, but such was Cynthia's love and devotion to John that his honesty and his tender way of breaking the news of his affairs developed into one of the frankest moments in their marriage since the turbulence of Beatlemania and drugs had pulled them apart. Strangely, says Cynthia, it was a very loving moment. I was in tears, not of anger or shock, but tears of happiness that he could tell me that we once again got close enough for him to get rid of it, talk it through, and put it on a different level. And then a bit later on the same page, when John told me he'd had all these affairs, I felt as though we were being brought together again, says Cynthia. He'd been leading his life as a musician and pop star, and I'd led mine as a wife and mother. Conversation had become very thin on the ground. He was doing so many things I wasn't involved in. Now, I'm sorry, I've got to be honest about this. I mean, this scene is slightly laughable. The idea that he would, and again, Cynthia was there. I'm not saying that this didn't happen. Let me explain in a sec. But first of all, Coleman saying honesty, one of John's most endearing characteristics. Okay, but, you know, he's being unfaithful hundreds of times. Is that endearing? I don't know. I've made the point many times, maybe on the podcast, but definitely when talking to people. The idea that a testosterone-filled rock star can go all around the world with women falling at his feet and never be unfaithful to his wife. Maybe Charlie Watts managed it, but, you know, if you put drink and drugs in there as well, it seems incredibly implausible that that would never happen. But putting his arms around her, and if he'd said perhaps, oh, I had an affair once, you know, it was that woman, blah, 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 it just meant nothing. But, you know, he's putting his arms lovingly around her and telling her that he's been with hundreds of other women. At the same time, you know, good on Cynthia for taking it that way. But anyway, here we go. Fast forward to the plane coming home from Rishikesh. Aboard the plane, flying home from India, John began drinking hard liquor for the first time in months. As the booze melted his inhibitions, the rage that lay at the bottom of his soul, like sulfuric acid under a wax stopper, began to fume up. For no apparent reason, he started telling Cynthia about all the women he'd fucked during the 8 years of their marriage, the hundreds of girls John had screwed on the road, as many as 7 in a single night, counted for little in his confessions. What he concentrated upon, according to Peter Brown, were the women whom Cynthia would recognise. Then he got down to women whom Cynthia knew personally, explaining that the reason this one turned up unexpectedly that night at Kenwood, or that one behaved so oddly in the restaurant, was that John was carrying on with her behind Cynthia's back. Whether his motive in making this confession was to goad Cynthia into suing for a divorce, or to punish her for some real or imagined indiscretion, makes little difference. The fact is that he hurt her horribly without helping himself one bit. We're going to get on to John's behaviour when he got back from India, but we know that India, apart from maybe some hooch and a few joints, was a drying out period, and I think John Lennon properly lost the plot, either in India or afterwards, or both. So again, there's kernels of truth, but the Peter Brown book, I don't know, it's been quite discredited. Peter Brown says that Cynthia slept with Magic Alex, and I believe Cynthia that they got drunk and Magic Alex made a pass and she wasn't interested. Again, you got to marvel at the difference here. It's incredible. We do know John had an affair with Sonny Freeman, the wife of Robert Freeman, who was one of the photographers who took photos of the Beatles, and they were living in the same building. So, again, possibly Goldman's taking that, magnifying it by 10 or 100 or whatever, and now suddenly John's focusing the most on the people that Cynthia knew. There's kernels of truth, like I said. Now we're going to talk about Yoko's pursuit of John. I won't read from Coleman, but the gist is that there was that famous incident where Yoko asked for a lift home from somewhere and got in the limo. I guess it was a psychedelic limo, the Rolls Royce, between John and Yoko. And in Cynthia's words, John and Cynthia shared a look, kind of rolling their eyes or whatever it was. On that subject, just a very, very quick tangent. I met Cynthia Lennon at a Beatles convention. It was somewhere in the Midlands, maybe Nottingham or Birmingham. I was living in Leicester at the time, so I know it was in the late 90s. I think I've told this story once before, but me and a couple of friends who were all Beatle heads, we were all about 22, 23 years old. Cheeky young lads, not unlike the Beatles themselves. And we cooked up the idea of having a chat to Cynthia and bringing Yoko's name into the conversation. A bit cheeky, but we didn't do it in a nasty way. So after Cynthia had been interviewed, she was mingling. And so I just said, "Oh, hi, Cynthia, I'm a John Lennon fan," or whatever. Some rubbish I said. And she said hi, and I think there was someone handing out cups of tea or something like that. There was no booze involved. And we just talked to her for about 5 minutes, I think. And someone brought up Yoko's name, and all Cynthia did was just smile ironically and roll her eyes. And that was it. We didn't pursue it, because we maybe were feeling a bit guilty. If lads of 22 or 23 ever do feel guilty, maybe they don't. Anyways, so let's read a little bit of Goldman. This is about the cab incident, in fact. One night when John and Cynthia stepped into the back seat of their limo, Yoko threw herself between them, promptly deposited at her own door. She shifted her beat next to Kenwood, where she hung about in such dreadful weather that Mrs. Powell took pity on her and admitted her to the house so that she might call a cab. Yoko took advantage of the opportunity to plant a ring, which she could return later to reclaim. She also began bombarding John with notes, begging for money to present her art and threatening, "If you don't support me, that's it, I'll kill myself." Cynthia, who had already begun to brood about this strange little Oriental, was shocked one day when she and her mother observed John opening a parcel addressed to him by Yoko, inside which he discovered a Kotex box containing a broken cup smeared with red paint. Some men would have been turned off by Yoko's tactics, but John Lennon was titillated. He was accustomed to being the prey, not the hunter. Yet most of the women who had chased him had been types he scorned, groupies, showgirls, whores, and little fans sent up to his suite like a steak from room service. Never in all the years since his passionate affair with Cynthia in art school had he been in love or even seriously involved with a woman. His passion, the strange amalgam of love and hate that was the essence of his being, had long been focused on Brian Epstein, whom he confessed in an interview years later he had, quote, loved more than a woman. For a woman to stir John deeply, she had to possess a strong masculine component. Here is where the aggressive Yoko began to tip the beam. which she inclined further by being an Oriental, Lennon's favourite type, and further yet by embodying the New York avant-garde scene, which meant a lot now to John since he had become the leader of the rock avant-garde. In fine, John Lennon was a man upon whom Yoko could work her spell. What's more, he could rationalise that he ran no risk because he held all the cards. He was accustomed to picking up women and boffing them in the back seat of his limo. Why shouldn't he give Yoko a toss? John began to weaken, reported Les Anthony. Came the day when Cynthia went off to the north and Yoko arrived at their house in order to discuss John sponsoring some art show. A business meeting, they said it was, but she didn't go back until the morning, and after that John couldn't leave her alone. In those first days before John left Cynthia, he and Yoko used to do their courting, to put it politely, in the back of the car while I was driving them around. How different is this eyewitness report from the Hollywood fantasy that John and Yoko laboured for years to impose on the public. According to that account, 18 months elapsed between the first meeting of these lovers and the consummation of their passion at Kenwood. According to Les Anthony, who was certainly in a position to know, the time between meeting and mating was exactly 3 weeks. Okay, there's a bit of inconsistency in there. Plus, again, there's supposition and this idea that John was never interested in any woman since Cynthia. I mean, he had an infatuation with Alma Cogan, for one. A lot of people said that he was in love with her. Whether that was consummated or not, I don't know. She came round about sponsoring one of her shows. Well, that wasn't 3 weeks after they met. He wasn't sponsoring her shows at the end of 66. So take that for what it's worth. It doesn't really matter when they first had sex anyway. I mean, I have read actually that it happened at the 14-hour Technicolor Dream in April 67, but John was pretty fried after apparently snorting acid mixed with cocaine, according to John Dunbar. Never heard of anyone snorting acid, but I guess he was taking acid and snorting cocaine, something like that. And he was described on acid by someone, maybe Dunbar as well, as monastic. I can't imagine they got together that night. But what's more important is that they came out as a couple and John decided to break up his marriage, and that was May 68. On the subject of her pursuing him, Tony Bramwell's book, Magical Mystery Tours, which is riddled with errors but has got some amazing stories, and again, Tony was there. That's more extreme with Goldman in terms of the fevered pursuit of John by Yoko and how he spent a long time rebuffing her before he finally gave in and they became John and Yoko, one word. So let's talk about May 1968. On the recent show we did about 1968, Matt Williamson and I decided that this was possibly the craziest month of John Lennon's life, which is really saying something. Coleman seems to have no idea of John's lunatic behaviour after the India trip, which we'll get to in a sec, and which we covered quite extensively in that 1968 show. Now, talking about drugs, there's a bit in the Coleman book that, again, I found a little bit laughable. We're back to Rishikesh for a sec. In Rishikesh, the meditation was a healing influence, and the changed environment was good for John, but Cynthia noticed his jittery behaviour. Every morning he would be up and out of our room before me at 7 o'clock, saying he was off to meditate alone, she says. He cut me dead in the mornings. The first week we were in India it was fine, but after that he cut me off from himself. We'd always done things together. Hang on, wait for me, John, I said. No, I'm off, was his answer. I couldn't understand why at the time. I put it down to being away and his changed attitudes to meditation and the beauty that there were now no drugs. Meditation had killed the pushers stone dead, which I was thrilled about because it was getting to a very dangerous state. So a little revelation that it was only about a week that John and Cynthia were in the same room in India, and they were there about 2 months. But this thing about, there were no pushers in Rishikesh, I mean, this is promoting this idea that no one takes drugs unless they're pushed on them. And it drives me mad because it's not getting us any closer to making progress. I mean, when I was a kid and at school, they would show us these videos of pushers, quote unquote, hanging around outside schools, going, "Would you like a taste, little boy or little girl?" Again, I'm not blaming Cynthia because this is an idea that's promoted a lot in the mainstream media. And it doesn't get us any further because it's not making any attempt to understand why people take drugs, why society is so fucked up that people have to take drugs. And I'm going to play again. I've played this 4 or 5 times over the years on Glass Onion, but I love this clip so much. This is John Lennon on Dick Cavett in 1971, talking about the drug problem and dropping a few truth bombs regarding drugs.
What do you think could be done about drug overdosing in or out of the profession of music?
I think the basic thing nobody asks is why do people take drugs of any sort, from alcohol to Asperos to hard drugs. And that question has to be resolved first before you think, well, what can we do for the poor drug addict? Why do we and you and anybody have to have these accessories to normal living to live? I mean, is there something wrong with society that's making us so pressurized that we cannot live in it without guarding ourselves against it? So it's that basic, the
More
problem.
Communication.
I think if people are allowed to be a bit more free and express themselves, they wouldn't have to inhibit themselves by taking drugs to not be hurt. People take drugs and drink so as they don't feel what's going on around them. People are frightened of freedom. They think freedom, oh, there'll be excesses. Of course there would be excess to an extent, and then it would settle down. And all forms of freedom will be the same as that. If people are allowed to be completely free, it will level out and people will be less inhibited and not be frightened of each other and wouldn't have to take drugs to prevent being hurt by each other.
So there you go. Cynthia's quote, "No pushes in Rishikesh." I mean, this is... I'm reminded, just very recently there was a news story, and the headline was something like, "Cannabis smoking couple kill baby son." And I read a little bit of this story, and it is the most horrendous shit you have ever heard about what they did to their baby son. I'm not even going to talk about it anymore. I've read some stuff in my time, but this is horrendous. But that headline, "Cannabis smoking couple," it's giving the idea, when we're back to reefer madness, I mean, that was in the fucking 20s or 30s. You know, if you've ever seen Reefer Madness, it is basically an unintentional comedy, but at the time it was taken seriously. Some guy takes a hit on a joint and he's completely demented, and I can't remember the details, but he's either kills someone or he wants to kill someone. And the thing about it is that cannabis is not even mentioned in this news story, only in the headline. And people who know nothing about drugs, maybe the older generations, but probably some younger generations as well, they'll see the words cannabis and the phrase "killed baby son" and put those things together. The idea that smoking cannabis would make people torture their baby son if they weren't inclined to do that anyway is just laughable. I can believe other drugs were involved in that story, but that still wouldn't be the sole cause. It's just... And I refuse to believe that the average journalist is that innocent. So they're obviously willfully offering a misleading slant. And that wasn't even in a tabloid. I think I got that from the LBC radio website, I think, and it was in a couple of other ones. You know, if it had only been in The Sun, then I probably could have believed that it was just tabloid propaganda, the cannabis aspect of it. Going back to Cynthia, I mean, she seems like she was a nice lady, and like I said earlier, I did meet her, and she seemed just very genuine and nice, but she was also a normie, you know, and normie is a slight pejorative, I suppose, but she even said it herself, and she was gracious enough to say that when she saw John and Yoko together, she knew they were right for each other. I'm just going to read a little bit, in fact. This is a famous occasion, famous in Beatle land anyway, when Cynthia came back from holiday and found John and Yoko together. Once inside, Cynthia, followed by Jenny Boyd and Magic Alex, walked slowly around shouting, "Is anybody there? John, Julian, Dot?" Still there was no sound. Cynthia ran round all the rooms on the ground floor until finally reaching the dining room and kitchen. Off this, in the sunroom, the sight that faced her left her dumbstruck. John, in his green and white striped toweling robe, hair dishevelled, mug of tea in his hand, sat on the small settee, facing Cynthia as she walked in. Yoko, her mass of black hair cascading down the back of a chair, making her instantly recognisable, sat on a chair facing John. She was motionless, her back to Cynthia, who had stopped dead in the doorway. It was like walking into a brick wall, as if I didn't belong anymore. I felt absolutely shut out from communication. I think we know a lot of this story. John sort of says, "Oh, hi," you know, as if nothing's going on. But the bit that was very interesting is this: seized by a need to get out of the house as soon as she could, Cynthia was ready to leave within 15 minutes of her arrival and confrontation. I decided John had been almost willing me to go. I took his silence as saying, "Don't interrupt this fantastic situation. Get lost. You're spoiling things." I got the message immediately without any more words. So again, I think that reflects well on Cynthia, that thing of just realising what the truth was and not fighting it. Perhaps she could have fought it, but I think John and Yoko were going to get together at that point. Having said all that, and I'm not afraid to criticise John Lennon, as long-time listeners will know, in the 1968 show we detailed how soon after they were caught, and we think it was somewhere between May the 3rd and the 5th. I said the date in the 68 show, I can't remember it, but John actually went back to Cynthia briefly, and they may have even slept together the same night or 2 nights after. And he was also tomcatting, to use the Nothing Is Real guy's words, in New York when they did the Apple promo visit, he and Paul, and he was getting it on with the maid at Nat Weiss's apartment where they were staying. So take everything in the John Yoko story with a pinch of salt, or maybe a cellar of salt perhaps. And John's quote to Pete Shotton, "This is what I've been waiting for all my life." You could modify that to just have another week with Cynthia and then I'll get it on with the maid in New York, and then I want to be with Yoko forever. Strange days indeed, as John Lennon once sung. Now I'm going to end this little segment, because this is going to be half the show otherwise, with Goldman's account of those crazy days of May 68. This is a bit of a long section, but I think the writing is really good. Already in the bits that I've read of Goldman and Coleman, you can see the problems and you can see why they're two extremes of a continuum. I think most of what I'm about to read from Goldman is actually true in terms of facts, but there's the usual spin. So here we go. This is just after they've got back from India. Baffled in his desire to break free, John took off on a tremendous drug binge as soon as he got home. He dropped acid and smoked tea. He popped pills and drank whiskey. He tooted cocaine and horned heroin. Having discovered that the faith that obviates the need for drugs was itself just another deceiving opiate, he felt justified in kicking out the jams. Within a month he was so fucked up he could have been declared non compos mentis. As always at a moment of crisis, John longed to retire into seclusion. So just 2 weeks after her return from India, Cynthia found herself leaving the country again, this time in the company of Magic Alex and Jenny Boyd, Patty's younger sister, bound for Greece. Okay, I'll go forward a little bit. This is about John. A born fantasist, he was more lustful in his mind than he was in reality, a fact that explains his farcical encounter at this time with Bridget Bardo. John had been infatuated with the famous sex goddess since adolescence, having made love to her countless times with a practised hand while lying on his bed, gazing up at the ceiling, where he had assembled a life-size picture of the bikini-clad actress by pasting together pages torn one at a time from a weekly newspaper. Imagine how he felt when Apple's PR man Derek Taylor announced that Bardo was in London and dying to meet the Beatles. "Great," exclaimed John, but in the next breath he asked, "Where are the others?" When he learned that none of the Beatles was in town, he panicked. He couldn't possibly handle a meeting with Bardo alone. Even when Derek Taylor offered to accompany John, he was still groping for support. He proposed they do a little acid first. Not so much to get out of our heads, but just a little sparkle. That was a fatal decision, because by the time Lennon and Taylor reached the Mayfair Hotel, they were bonkers. Taylor had sought to pave the way for his friend and employer by ringing up Bardo's personal assistant and explaining that John Lennon had just returned from a long pilgrimage to India, where he had sat at the feet of the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. Taylor suggested that the most suitable way to receive the great rock star would be in a room furnished with cushions filled with flowers and resounding to the music of Ravi Shankar. Just going forward a bit, no change in decor could relieve John Lennon's anxiety or enable him to regain control of his addled pate. Without saying a word, he sank down upon the cushions in the lotus position and shut his eyes as if to meditate. For the next half hour he remained in that position without uttering a word. Brigitte Bardot was not enchanted by this bizarre behaviour. Having anticipated the arrival of all the Beatles, she had invited several pretty girls, designing to take the whole party to a chic restaurant for supper. Now she was stuck with just one Beatle, who was in another world, and a flunky who resembled Ronald Coleman. Raising her voice, she addressed the strange figure squatting on her floor. "India appears to have made quite an impression on you." "Don't ask questions," John snapped. "Feel the vibes." 2 hours later, Bardo made a second attempt to arouse Lennon from his trance. She proposed that they all go to Parks, a very chic restaurant on Beecham Place. Lennon and Taylor were both horrified by this suggestion because Parks was a tiny place owned by some Liverpudlians. If they turned up there in the company of Brigitte Bardot and a lot of flashy-looking young women, word of the evening would fly all over town and get into the papers, which would mean bad press for Lennon and a nasty scene at home for Taylor. I'll just go forward a little bit. So John suggested Bardo go to supper. "When you get back, I shall have written a song for you." When Bardo got back late that night, she could hear the Indian music blaring down the hall long before she reached her door. Walking into the sitting room, she stopped short. There, sprawled across the cushions like a bum on the sidewalk, lay the great John Lennon, surrounded by a litter of empty beer bottles. When Bardo went into her bedroom, she was startled again. this time by the spectacle of Derek Taylor laid out cold across her counterpane. Having re-entered the sitting room, Bardo started shaking Lennon roughly. He struggled valiantly into the upright position and tried to sing something. After a few bars, he toppled over and went back to sleep. Yeah, who knows? I don't know where all that came from, that information. If anyone knows what book that came from, let me know. John Lennon's crazy encounter with Bridget Bardo was of a piece with everything he did during this period of drug madness. A couple of nights later, John and Pete were tripping on acid and struggling to make tapes of ambient noise on the Brunel machines in John's attic. When John got tired of assembling what was later released as Revolution 9, he sat down cross-legged on the floor to have a heart-to-heart with Pete. Now, I've never heard of the fact that Pete Shotton was involved in compiling Revolution 9, so I think that's wrong. As Pete eyed a large photograph of Bridget Bardo, imagining all the things he would have done to her if he could have enjoyed John's recent opportunity, he noticed that his friend was making slow whirling movements with his arms and hands, as if he had wings. "Pete," John breathed in an awed whisper, "I think I'm Jesus Christ." Pete had not been John Lennon's comrade all his life for nothing. Almost matter-of-factly, he replied, "What are you going to do about it?" Without a moment's hesitation, John declared, "I've got to tell everyone. I've got to let the world know who I am." And then John says to Pete, "How old was Jesus when they killed him?" Pete said, "I reckon he was 32. He was 33, in fact. John started counting laboriously on his fingers. Then he exclaimed, "Hell, that gives me about 4 years," which would have actually been 5 years. That afternoon, the inner circle of the Beatles organisation, Paul, George, Ringo, Neil and Derek, met with John and Pete in Lennon's office. All arrived in a mood of keen expectation, wondering what could have inspired the normally passive Lennon to ring the alarm. John rose from behind his desk and addressed his colleagues. "I've got something very important to tell you all," he began. "I'm Jesus Christ come back again. This is my thing." Then he demands that they have a press release. They sat there stunned for a moment. Then they all agreed this was the most important announcement, but they cautioned that they would need time to reflect on its meaning and decide what steps should be taken by Apple. In another book, someone says, oh, right, should we go for lunch? Or something like that. John was still in the grip of his delusion when he and Pete went into a restaurant for supper. They were addressed by a genial middle-aged man, delighted to find himself standing next to the famous pop star. "Really nice to meet you," said the man. "How are you?" John replied without dropping a beat, "Actually, I'm Jesus Christ." The man didn't turn a hair. "Oh, really?" he replied. "Well, I love your last record. Thought it was great." And there you go. There's a bit of comedy in there. I like the writing, but as you can see, there are some claims and inaccuracies in there which can quite clearly be debunked. That was in 1988, let's remember, and Coleman was in 1984, so the Beatles research has come on a lot since then. But I hope you enjoyed that, some comparisons. Wasn't expecting it to be 50 minutes, but there you go. Just literally one more comment to make about that. I've always found it very weird that Goldman starts and ends his book with Yoko. The first chapter is all about Yoko scoring heroin in 1979, which was a real eye-opener after having read Coleman. But anyway, if you remember me saying on a previous show, I read them both within about 6 months of each other, about the age of 14, and it was quite an experience. But considering what a low opinion he seems to have of her, so he starts the book with her and he ends the book. The last bit of the book is Marnie Hare saying she looked marvellous, a year after John's death when Yoko was with Sam Havertoy. Very strange. Just one other thing before we get to the main part of this show. May Pang's new documentary, The Lost Weekend, A Love Story, is out. For those in England, apparently it's coming to the cinemas in England in June. Look out for that. I'll put a link to the trailer in the show notes. That documentary is really the Goldman to Madeleine Boccaro's Coleman-esque narrative of John and Yoko. Let me qualify that by saying that although Goldman did quote May's book that she wrote in the 80s, May's version is not as extreme and seems to have quite a bit of integrity to it. Now, finally, let's cut to me a month ago when I recorded this, when I was a completely different person. I was so much older then. Oops, wrong 60s icon. Hi to John Stewart, if you're listening, author of Dylan Lennon, Marx and God, and former guest. Please check out John's book if you get a chance. It's really fantastic. I love the dual biography idea. I won't be back on the other side with a few words because frankly you've had enough words from me already. This is a 50-minute intro plus all the words you're going to hear in the main body of the show. So I'll just say See you pretty soon for what will definitely be the last part of this now 3-parter. But for now, enjoy. These Playboy transcriptions that I'm reading from, they're pretty rambling. It's not necessarily a through line. It's all over the place, in fact. And if you remember from part 1, one of the things I found was that there were certain themes that went through the interviews, and John would go off on a tangent and then come back to maybe 3 or 4 core themes, such as, the need to be an artist, but also the feeling that you don't have to create art for the sake of it. And then he talked about this teacher-pupil relationship with Yoko. In part 1 as well, I talked a little bit about Madeleine Baccaro's Yoko book and some of Yoko's philosophies in general, and it kind of tied in with these Playboy interviews. One of the things is that there's so many ideas in the book about Yoko and these interviews, so it's an ideal thing to pick apart, and I just cherry-picked. Now, you're probably hearing this, I imagine, in April. I'm actually recording this on February the 28th, so with that strange trick of time where I'm recording something, but you're hearing it at a later date. At the time you're hearing this, and in fact, probably before part 1 went out, I put out a special about Michael Caine, because he turned 90 on the 14th. See what I mean? So I'm saying he's turning 90 on the 14th, but from the perspective when you're listening to it, of course, he's already turned 90, so I hope he had a good birthday 2 weeks from now. That was a good show. I remember once doing a podcast with someone, and they were saying, if we haven't blown ourselves up with nuclear weapons, someone could be listening to this conceivably in 100 years. He said, when you and I have well fallen off the perch, after my death, I would like my work to remain online, but who knows what the internet will look like. Wow, it's quite scary to think about, really, isn't it? Anyway, what I'm going to do here, I'm going to carry on. I don't plan this too much because I know I'm going to have plenty of stuff to say in the interjections. So what I did really was just highlight some page numbers and some extracts and see what occurs in the moment, really. The next section of the book, so Yoko says, even now I just read that Paul said, I understand that he wants to be with her, but why does he have to be with her all the time? John says, Yoko, do you still have to carry that cross? That was years ago. That's a quote from the song I'm Losing You, by the way. And then Yoko Ono says, no, he said it recently. I mean, what happened with John is that I sort of went to bed with this guy that I liked, and suddenly the next morning I see these 3 guys standing there with resentful eyes. Another version of that story, she says, I woke up, everyone in Britain was suddenly my mother-in-law, or something like that. But I'm sure Paul in 1980 wasn't still saying, why does he want to be with her all the time? What you learn, of course, and we've got an example of it later, of something that John said that was taken out of context and kind of fed back to Paul, and Paul dealt with it fairly well. I'll explain it when we get there. If you know the One Sweet Dream podcast, I mean, they've spent a long time on the John and Paul relationship, so I'm sure they've dealt with this kind of thing already. My feeling about it is that probably around 1969, Paul was the one that wanted to keep the Beatles together. I always think of it as in order of how much the Beatles like being the Beatles in 69. It's probably Paul, Ringo, John, George. And it seemed like George was the one who really wanted out, if anyone did. John was on the fence. Ringo was fairly happy because, of course, professionally, Ringo knew he'd have a bit of a problem. That's why he tried to get an acting career going, which is very understandable. It seems like Paul did want to be a Beatle, but then he got tagged with that. And obviously after John's death, when it was all John was a saint, John was the cool one, John was the arty, intellectual one, Paul was a glib songwriter, it must have seriously irked him. Because he's got the double whammy of losing his friend, but then having to deal with all this crap that comes in the wake of that. So I don't buy this thing that Paul was desperate to get the Beatles back together. Of course, the big irony of that is that he's the one who sued them. Yes, he didn't want to sue his mates. He wanted to sue Klein, and it worked out that he had to sue his mates. But very early on in the 70s in interviews, Paul had said, the Beatles is over. Yeah, I'm not happy about that, but let's get on with it. I've got another band now, Wings. The interviewer says then, do you think that kind of attitude from people was also jealousy? When he says from people, I don't think he's talking about the ex-Beatles there, but John says it's a kind of jealousy. People can't stand people being in love. They absolutely can't stand it. They want to pull you down in the hole they're in, which, is highly cynical, really. Just following on from what we had at the end of part 1 about the 90% of children are born out of a whiskey bottle. It seems like, as I said in the previous episode, it's not as lovey-dovey as you think it is. The sort of darker truths are hidden in plain sight, I said before, and I'd stand by that. John says, it's your self-absorption with each other, it's your contentment with each other that people can't stand. Of course they're attracted to you because your energy is positive and high, of the highest form, but energy attracts energy suckers. Whether they come in the guise of friend or enemy is irrelevant. That's why the line in Watching the Wheels, no friends and no enemies, it comes in many mysterious forms. I think that's actually Clean Up Time, not Watching the Wheels. Anyway, they'll suck you dry. That's what that game is. It's hard enough to make it stay. This is an interesting point he makes here. John and Yoko did an interview that was on the Gimme Some Truth DVD. You know, the Gimme Some Truth was that documentary from 2000 about the making of the Imagine album, one of the many films related to the Imagine project. And he talked about, I don't want to possess Yoko, but in a way I do. It's that thing of fighting against yourself.
Do you think that in new attitudes towards love and relationships, would it be fair to say we're getting away from the property concept of relationships?
Of owning the other person? Yeah, we could be, but that's all very well intellectually, but when you actually are in love with somebody, you tend to be jealous and want to own them and possess them 100%, which I do. But intellectually, before that, I thought, that owning a person is rubbish. But I love Yoko. I want to possess her completely. I don't want to stifle her. The danger is that you want to possess them to death. It's after the beginning, when it cools down a bit, not cools down, whatever the word is, then you can allow each other to breathe, At first you tend to strangle each other, I think. Because you have so little as a child, I think it is. Once you find it, you want to hang on to it. You grab it so much, you tend to kill it.
He says, trying to possess it makes it go away. He's talking about love. Trying to possess somebody makes them go away. Every time you put your finger on it, it slips away. That's one of his lyrics, I think, isn't it? Every time you turn the microscope's light on, the thing changes, so you can never see what it is. As soon as you ask the question, it goes away. I find in my own life, and I found this for a long time, we're going into life coaching territory here, folks. If you chase something, it very often doesn't happen. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. If you chase the person that you think is the person of your dreams, maybe you'll get them for a short time, but things tend to happen better if they're organic or if you have a somewhat detached attitude to things. I'm not just talking about love, it could be many things, success of various kinds. One of the things I'm impressed actually with the interviewers, David Sheff and his colleagues, is they do challenge John, and we had a bit of that in part one. The criticism now retrospectively of Jan Wenner, who did the famous Rolling Stone interview, is that he was a Lennon fanboy. And certainly he made a thing of still representing that interview as truth. That interview, strangely enough, was recorded on December the 8th, 1970. Even when John had disowned it in a way, or had said to various people, George Martin, Hunter Davis, that he just makes things up or just says what's on his mind at that point. Moving on. Now, they challenge him about getting married, because you wouldn't think that John and Yoko would need to do something as, bland or mundane as getting married. You'd think their love would be enough on its own. So they talk about that, and John says, when we got married, we knew our honeymoon was going to be public anyway, so we decided to use it to make a statement. Our life is our art. That's what the bed-in was. We sat in bed and talked to reporters for 7 days. It was hilarious. In effect, we were doing a commercial for peace instead of a commercial for war. The reporters were going, yeah, sure, but it didn't matter because our commercial went out irrespective. As I've said, everyone puts down TV commercials, but they go around singing them. So something we've explored on Glass Onion many times is John Lennon's fascination and skill with advertising and marketing things. And that's what they were doing at the bed-in.
We're selling it like soap, and you've got to sell and sell until the housewife thinks, there's peace or war. That's the two products. Peace.
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 Peace. Peace. Peace. Peace. Peace. Peace. Peace. Peace. Peace. Peace. Peace. Peace. Peace.
Peace in your mind, peace on earth, peace at work, peace at home, peace in the world. It's to try and get people orientated to think peace, like eat for peace, breathe for peace, dance for peace, make love for peace, to just have the peace like a mantra going round and round in your head.
He knew the establishment media, what they call now the mainstream media, legacy media, would come in and they'd all want to ask questions about this bed-in, possibly thinking they were going to have sex. I don't know if that was their original motive, the reporters, I mean, for coming in. But he used the establishment media to rail against the establishment. And it's interesting there that he said it was hilarious. That's another thing about John and Yoko, and Dan Richter agreed with this, is that they didn't take themselves as seriously. They were willing to be the world's clowns, but between the two of them, they were quite childlike, you know, giggling and so forth. And they said, our life is our art. So when they had the car crash in Golspie in 1969, the one where Yoko and Julian were in the car, they exhibited, quote unquote, the smashed up car. I think they had it parked outside Tittenhurst Park as a kind of a display. So their life was their art. That was one thing that was fairly consistent about them. When I was talking about Yoko in part one at the beginning, the intro part, there was that thing she said about, someone said, how would you deal with Hitler? And she said, I'd go to bed with him. And she comments on that here. I said it facetiously, of course, but the point is you're not going to change the world by fighting. Maybe I was naive about the 10 days with Hitler. After all, it took 13 years with John Lennon. So Yoko did have an interesting and a funny turn of phrase at times. You know, they weren't quite as naive as people think. You know, I challenged that. I remember when James Corbett was on, we reviewed the US versus John Lennon a year or so ago. And we were saying we didn't think they were as naive as people thought. Possibly they were in certain things. You know, that's one of the fascinations of John Lennon, streetwise and naive at exactly the same time. Now there's some talk about drugs. So the interviewer says, do you still take LSD? John says, not in years. A little mushroom or peyote is not beyond my scope, you know, maybe twice a year or something. But acid is a chemical. People are taking it, though, even though you don't hear about it anymore. But people are still visiting the cosmos. It's just that nobody talks about it. You get sent to prison. Maybe a reference to the war on drugs that Nixon started, and which the US is still very gung-ho about. Now here's a telling quote. We must always remember to thank the CIA and the Army for LSD, by the way. That's what people forget. Everything is the opposite of what it is, isn't it? They brought out LSD to control people, and what they did was give us freedom. Sometimes it works in mysterious ways, its wonders to perform, but it sure as hell performs them. If you look at the government report book on acid, the only ones that jumped out of the windows because of it were the ones in the army. I never knew anybody who jumped out of a window or killed themselves because of it. It's a famous Bill Hicks clip.
Always that same LSD story, you've all seen it. Young man on acid thought he could fly, jumped out of a building. What a tragedy. What a dick. Fuck him. He's an idiot. If he thought he could fly, why didn't he take off on the ground first? Check it out. You don't see ducks lined up to catch elevators to fly south. They fly from the ground, you moron. Quit ruining for everybody. I don't mean to sound cold or cruel or vicious, but I am, so that's the way it comes out. How about a positive LSD story? Wouldn't that be newsworthy just once? To base your decision on information rather than scare tactics and superstitions and lies? I think it would be newsworthy. Today, a young man on acid realized that all matter is merely energy condensed to a slow vibration, that we are all one consciousness experiencing itself subjectively. There is no such thing as death. Life is only a dream, and we're the imagination of ourselves. Here's Tom with the weather.
I would make the distinction between synthetic and organic drugs. So I think peyote is a plant, isn't it? Yeah. And mushrooms, obviously, they grow in the ground.
To make marijuana against the law is like saying God made a mistake. You know what I mean? It's like God on the seventh day looked down at his creation. There it is, my creation, perfect and holy in all ways. Now I can rest. Oh my me. I left fucking pot everywhere. I should never have smoked that joint on the third day. That was the day I created possums. Still gives me a chuckle. If I leave pot everywhere, that's going to give humans the impression they're supposed to use it. Now I have to create Republicans. I believe that God left certain drugs growing naturally upon our planet to help speed up and facilitate our evolution. Okay, not the most popular idea ever expressed. Either that or you're real high and agreeing with me in the only way you can right now. I forgot the code. Is it 2 blinks yes, 1 blink no? Do you think magic mushrooms growing atop cow shit was an accident? Where do you think the phrase, "that's good shit," came from? Why do you think Hindus think cows are holy? Holy shit.
And yes, in Fred Seaman's book, they talk about doing shrooms together. Doing drugs with John Lennon, hallucinogenics, would be quite interesting. I've always thought it's strange, or perhaps admirable is another word, that John Dunbar has never really talked too much about his experiences with John, because they did a lot of chemicals together, LSD and so forth.
The entire moment came together at the 14-hour Technicolor Dream, Britain's biggest ever hippie happening.
What would you describe as the purpose of this evening, the 14-hour Technicolor Dream?
Oh, well, I think that there's a new period. We're starting a new era, sweeping around as a kind of reaction to various things that have been happening in the world. And it makes itself, manifests itself in love and sweetness and kindness and flowers.
It was an extraordinary experience, and because there were so many bands, and because Alexandra Palace was so large, we had a stage at each end. So there was actually a point in the middle where you could get an extraordinary stereo effect of 2 bands simultaneously. And then there were all the usual hippie fad things. You know, at that point, that was like the 2 weeks when smoking banana peelings was in as a way of getting high. So there was a sort of igloo there with the Susie cream cheese in there dispensing bananas.
Did you go to that?
I helped organise it.
Right. Do you remember me there?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
You were there with John Lennon.
I know, but we'd just taken we'd taken a big lot of acid. So the whole thing was kind of like really, and it was kind of weird because I was with John. You know, people would come out of the woodwork, and like there was people I sort of, hadn't seen since kind of kindergarten school, sort of coming out. It was a very weird evening.
And the thing about the CIA and LSD, the book Acid Dreams is highly recommended. The audiobook's available and the print book. And when Matt Sergio was on the show, I think it was episode 63, I'm going to say, The Occult Beatles, he talked a lot about that. He knows a lot about that. And if you look on his blog of the same name, you'll find some stuff about that. So yeah, the CIA did, to some extent, introduce LSD into the culture, and it had the opposite effect. Right, then John talks about flashbacks. He says, I took millions of trips in the 60s. It's classic John. It's just hyperbole, It's there are people trying to trace how he took 1,000 trips, and I saw one blog online that was trying to work out how many that was a day and mapping out all the times when he wasn't recording at the studio and things like that. John says, I've had bad trips and other people have had bad trips, but I've had a bad trip in real life. I've had a bad trip on a joint. I can get paranoid just sitting in a restaurant. I don't have to take anything. Acid is only real life in CinemaScope. Whatever experience you had is what you would have had anyway. I'm not promoting all you committees out there, and I don't use it because it's chemical, but all the garbage about what it did to people is garbage. And they talk about other drugs, marijuana. If someone gives me a joint, I might smoke it, but I don't go after it. Yeah, not quite true. I think he had it on him quite a lot, and we know that Fred Seaman and Robert Rosen used to smoke it in the station wagon. Cocaine, I had lots of it in my day, but I don't like it. It's a dumb drug. Your whole concentration goes on getting the next fix. I find caffeine easier to deal with. So yeah, I think John was pretty into caffeine, and I think giving that up would have been a tricky thing for him to do going forward. Coffee and cigarettes, I guess. I believe that he didn't drink much, because I think he was sensible enough to know that that was really his worst drug, behaviour-wise. I still contend almost every bad story you hear about John Lennon, apart from the occasional rude remark, but those things about, obviously Bob Wooler, the thing on a ferry boat when he trapped a girl's fingers in a door and was laughing with glee. I think he was drunk then. I think every bad story, and it's not to excuse, we've gone through this many times in the past. It's not excusing it, but it is explaining it to some extent. So yeah, I don't think he was drinking much. Then he talks about the macrobiotic diet. Now, here's an interesting bit. Jon Stewart was on the podcast 2 visits and 3 episodes, and during that, he mentioned that in his book, Dylan, Lennon, Marx and God, he had mentioned that John Lennon and Bob Dylan have both questioned evolution. And John says, we don't buy the establishment version of it at all. He starts talking about macrobiotic food, and then he's talking about the big C, which is cancer. So he says, we don't buy the establishment version of it at all. Nor do I think we came from monkeys, by the way. John says, to change the subject, that's another piece of garbage. What the hell is it based on? We couldn't have come from anything. Fish, maybe, but not monkeys. I don't believe in the evolution of fish to monkeys to men. Why aren't monkeys changing into men now? It's absolute garbage. That is something I've never pondered. Why do some monkeys change into men and some remain monkeys? Anyway, it's absolute irrational garbage, as mad as the ones who believe the world was made only 4,000 years ago, the fundamentalists. That and the monkey thing are both as insane as the other. I've nothing to base it on, it's only a gut feeling. Then he makes a joke, I don't buy that monkey business, and starts singing Too Much Monkey Business, which is a Chuck Berry song that the Beatles did. It was on live at the BBC. Brilliant version. And incidentally, Too Much Monkey Business inspired Subterranean Homesick Blues, which inspired It's the End of the World as We Know It by R.E.M. and indeed Hard Road by Anthony Rotuno.
Well, if you're gonna catch me, you better make it quick, 'cause if there's one thing I hate is people who stick to the same little plan that they've got in life, which is they watch you go by and never try to do anything else. 'Cause it's gonna be a hard, hard road, and when you don't feel alright, I'll be looking down at you and laughing hard to sorry plight.
So yeah, he's not buying evolution, but doesn't have anything to base it on. Now here's an interesting thing. This is in between the transcripts. David Sheff said, that night when I arrived to meet John at the apartment, he answered the door singing his greeting. Here's David Sheff, come to ask questions and answers that no one will hear, to the tune of Eleanor Rigby. Here's David Sheff, come to ask questions with answers that no one will hear. In the kitchen, the radio blurted a news report about a demonstration outside New York City against nuclear power. That veered our conversation to the political movements of today. John Lennon says, all the movements got it all wrong. All the money and energy spent on attacking the nuclear industry is giving power to the nuclear industry. If the same energy and money were put into finding alternatives, they might get somewhere. While their minds are on the nuclear industry, there's no alternative, and what they want is unrealistic. As I said, they give it power. If they really want to deal with the problem, they have to take all the attention off it and onto the solution. And I know what he means there, you know, I mean, that's one of Yoko's things as well, is where you direct your attention. And it's true that if you do want to stop something, the natural inclination is to keep talking about that thing in the context of wanting to stop it. But I suppose he's making the point, if you focus on alternative, you're putting positive focus on an alternative instead of negative energy onto the thing that you don't like. Yeah, it's a bit speculative, of course, but it's all about ideas. That's definitely the theme of these interviews. They talk a bit more about energy. Yoko talks about the secret of energy and the secret of life. She says, when all that hate energy was focused on me, it was transformed into a fantastic energy. It was supporting me. So if you're centered and you can transform all this energy that comes in, it will help you. If you believe it's going to kill you, it will kill you. Isn't that kind of saying the opposite? She's saying that negative energy makes her stronger. Certainly what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. I don't believe in a life of no struggle. I think that's a weirdly empty life, in fact. So if there's one thing we can certainly say about Yoko and I guess John, you know, they did use their struggles to evolve to some extent. He's a little bit negative about Jerry Rubin and Abby Hoffman. One of them, I think it was Jerry Rubin, was an early investor in Apple, wasn't he? We covered that on the show before and became a millionaire. But of course you could equally say by the end of the 70s, John was a multi-millionaire as well, living very comfortably. Perhaps not comfortably in his head. That's the Coleman and Goldman thing, isn't it? But comfortably materially. Although in part one he rather unconvincingly explained that away. If you remember, I wasn't very convinced by that at all. Right, let's skip forward a bit to the next section. Sheff writes, talk about politics in the 60s eventually led to the name of Bob Dylan, a peer of sorts of John's. Is it distressing, I asked, to see Dylan, once a fellow cynic, a born-again Christian? John says, I don't like to comment on it. For whatever reason he's doing it, it's personal for him and he needs to do it. I'm not distressed by the fact that Dylan is doing what Dylan wants or needs to do. I like him personally. I've known him for years, though I haven't seen him in years. I understand it and have nothing against it or for it. If he needs it, let him do it. I really enjoyed the Lennon-Dylan stuff. I did a two-parter with Ben Burrell in 2020, and then Ben came back and John Stewart was on. And again, I wholeheartedly recommend that book, Dylan, Lennon, Marx and God. Go and buy it and read it, folks. The reporter says, isn't Dylan preaching, though? And John says, people who don't want to hear it will just leave the theatre. Will they? It's back to the responsibility thing. People stay in the theatre because he's Bob Dylan. That's the interviewer saying that. Well, anybody who wants to hear Dylan just because of who he is isn't going to understand what Dylan is saying now or then. They're just following some kind of image. They're the sheep anyway. Still, the whole religion business does suffer from the onward Christian soldiers bit. There's too much talk about soldiers and marching and converting. I'm not pushing Buddhism because I'm no more a Buddhist than I am a Christian. But there's one thing I admire about the religion. There's no proselytizing. Yes, I mean, even though Buddhism is technically a religion, the Buddha is a god or a god figure. I studied a bit of Buddhism when I was in Thailand, and I went on those meditation retreats that I've talked about before. Maybe I talked on Life and Life Only, but I did 2 10-day silent meditation retreats. Buddhism is a gentle type of religion. Again, we're going back to a theme, really. People going to hear Dylan because he's Dylan. People becoming born-again Christians because Dylan's done that. Goes back to one of those core themes I was talking about of following heroes. John says, I was brought up Christian. I only now understand some of the things that Christ was saying in those parables when I got away from the interpretations that were thrown at me all my life. There's more to it. I must say I was surprised when old Bobby Boy did go that way. I was very surprised, but I was also surprised when he went to that Jewish group. That surprised me too, because all I ever hear whenever I hear about him is, and people can quote me and make me feel silly too, but all I ever think is, don't follow leaders, watch the parking meters. It's the same man, but it isn't the same man, and I don't want to say anything about a man who is searching or has found it. Right, it's the same man, but it isn't the same man. It's unfortunate when people say, this is the only way, that's the only thing I've got against anybody. They're saying, this is the only answer. I don't want to hear about that. There isn't one answer to anything. Yep, I'd agree with that. John seems to have some understanding of Bob, and the thing we concluded when we did those shows was that maybe they're a bit too similar. That's why they kept each other at arm's length. Dan Richter said they were friends, and he had a funny anecdote about meeting. I think it was at the San Regis, one of the hotels in New York. When you knew John, were you or was he ever in fear of his life? Did he ever feel like with his outspoken personality that something might happen? Or do you remember anything about that?
Yeah, I think so. It wasn't an obsession but when I was with him, we were always very careful. We'd be in the limo. I'll give you an example. We were staying at the Plaza Hotel, John, Yoko, and I. And John and Yoko had arranged to meet Bob Dylan, and he was going to be in the lobby of the Plaza. So we were in the car. We did not go to the main entrance. We went to the side entrance where the old Trader Vic's was on Central Park South. Stopped the car, and they stayed in the car. They stayed in the limo so nobody could see him. Nobody knew it was John Yoko. And I got out and looked around, just looking for weird people, Everything looked okay. So I went back and said, okay, let's go. The idea was to walk directly to things, not loiter or anything like that, So we walked in, and as we were walking across the lobby looking for Bob, suddenly this guy who looked like Jack Ruby with a hat and a suit came running towards us and stuck his hand inside his coat. And I thought, oh, shit. So I jumped up in front of him. I said, who are you? Talk to me, thinking I'm going to get shot now. And the guy pulls out this badge and says, I'm security. I'm here to help, if there's anything you need. So we get in the elevator. Get in the elevator. Don't want to stick around here. And this guy with shades on and a hat pulled down and an army jacket gets in beside us, and he's laughing. And it's Bob, who had been there all the time, just completely anonymous.
Do you think they got on? Do they have a decent relationship, do you think, from what you
I think so. The thing is that musicians have something in common. They're all famous performers, and it's much easier for John Lennon to talk to Bob Dylan than to talk to just about anybody else, because just about anybody else is going to be going, I am talking to John Lennon.
Yeah, they're not going to be able to talk to him normally.
Yeah, well, anything you want. Yes, please. Thank you. And can you loan me $2,000? And so these two guys, they're both very famous, gifted musical geniuses who've had great success. And they have that. There are not many other people like that on the globe. And I saw this repeatedly. And quite often, they would be friends with other performers who weren't so famous, but they shared the same thing. It was a camaraderie. It was quite natural.
Absolutely. Shared experiences, isn't it?
Yeah.
Especially a shared strange experience, of being famous.
Yeah. I mean, it's tough being a rock and roll star.
Yeah.
It's got its downsides.
This is an interesting insight. I've been frightened enough myself to want to latch on to something. It's that wanting to belong. It sounds like an excuse for stupidity half the time, but it's a dual thing one has of wanting to be outside of society because one can see through it, as it were, and it allows a clarity of vision for an artist or poet to look at society separately, but at the same time wanting desperately to be accepted by society too. That's one of his quotes, isn't it?
I always was a rebel, but on the other hand, I want to be loved and accepted by all facets of society and not be this loudmouth, lunatic poet, musician, but I cannot be what I'm not.
We have a bit of that, right? Most creative, artistic people do feel separate, but then we kind of want to belong, because it's lonely not belonging to anything. So he says, to belong, I'm like the monkey in the Chinese story. I'm a bit quicker in and a bit quicker out. I jump in because I want to belong, and I jump out because I remember the whole game is not to belong, but to belong to the whole thing, not to one little section of it. Which might explain these sudden, could almost say fetishes or need for a father figure. Probably did fetishize to some extent the Maharishi and Janov and things like that. But then he realizes, because he's quite an instinctive person and he's quite quick on the uptake as well, he sees through it and then he quite quickly disowns it. That was obviously a theme that we all know about. Now he carries on about Dylan.
Offhand, one can say he'd had the traumatic experience of divorce from Sarah, separation from his children, or a different atmosphere, then being, after, first of all, feeling like a lot of husbands away for the weekend, I'm free again, I'm a bachelor again, I get to do all the little things I couldn't do when I was a father, and then finding out that wasn't where it was at, that he missed his family, maybe his career or his creativity isn't at its height, maybe he needs a break, instead of having a motorcycle accident to knock him out, which is what he did the first time. What he needs is to go away and do what he did without smashing himself on a motorbike and get away from all the sycophants.
Whether they be Jesus sycophants or JDL sycophants. I think that's Jewish Defence League, isn't it? So this thing about similarities, you almost feel like John could say that to himself, right? He alludes to the fact that the motorcycle accident was, if not deliberate, then perhaps subconscious. And when Ben Burrell was on the first time, he said there probably was a motorbike accident, but perhaps it wasn't as serious. And it was, in a funny way, what he needed, because he'd been booked onto another exhausting tour by his manager, Albert Grossman. And that got him some rest, basically. John did go away. He says what he needs is to go away. And John did have this 5 years more or less out of the public eye. And then he says he wasn't ever that political, really. He wrote Blowing in the Wind and Soldier Song. Don't know what Soldier Song. Is that Masters of War? But they're just poetic politics, folk music of the day. He's commenting on what's going on like a journalist. He never stood in the corner and shouted anything. So that's an interesting thing. That came up in Jon Stewart's book as well. That as soon as Dylan got too close and seemed too active in the folk movement, and he did link arms at the end of one of the Newport folk festivals and sang We Shall Overcome, but you felt like, as with that song Ye Olde Playboys and Playgirls, Pete Seeger latched onto it and said 1 million people will be singing this by the end of the year. And in John's words, Dylan made sure they didn't, because he pretty much disowned that song. So Dylan and Lennon, they both doing a similar thing. They're a bit afraid, I think, to be too identified with one thing. Yeah, he carries on. It's what people read into what he did. It's only the constant necessity to identify and label people for the media and public. Maybe millions of people have been born again and then next Friday forgotten all about it. It just so happens that Dylan did it in public. Then we get on to one of my favourite John Lennon topics, which is primal scream therapy. John says, in the early 70s, Janov's book came in the mail and the name Primal Scream intrigued me. I mean, Yoko's been screaming a long time. Just the words, the title made my heart flutter. Then I read the testimonials, I'm Charlie so-and-so. I went in and this is what happened to me. That's me. It was the early days together and we were living in Ascot and there was still a lot of shit coming down on us. And these people say they get to this thing and they scream and they feel better. Okay, it's something other than taking a tab of acid and feeling better. So I thought, let's try it. I think at one point he says in this interview or another one, he says, I would have done it just because of the name. And think about that primal scream. Primal is getting right down to the essence. And, who doesn't like screaming? Maybe not in public, but maybe a few of us scream in private, right? In Madeline's book, she makes the point that John got the screaming thing from Yoko. I mean, okay, he was screaming on Twist and Shout, but that's almost to me more like an adolescent scream. I think, from Yer Blues onwards. You've got Yer Blues, I Want You, She's So Heavy. In fact, I like that scream so much, I might play it again.
I want you so bad, it's driving me mad,
And then obviously things like Mother and Well, Well, Well. There's some fantastic screaming on that. Regular listeners to the show will know that I've speculated many times that had John Lennon lived, he would have got together with Kurt Cobain on one level or another. And Kurt had a great scream. For example, on the last verse of Where Did You Sleep Last Night on Nirvana Unplugged. Very, very good screaming. You know when it's authentic and when someone's just screaming for the sake of it or for more of a fun thing. I always took Little Richard's screaming as more a scream of joy, really, rather than anguish. But yes, definitely would credit Yoko for some of John's screaming or the idea of that could be more powerful than words. And the interviewer says, what was the therapy like? John says, they do this thing where they mess around with you until they reach a point where you hit this scream thing. You go with it. They encourage you to go with it. And you kind of make a physical, mental, cosmic breakthrough with the scream itself. I can compare it to acid in as much as you take the trip, and what you do with it afterwards when the drug's worn off is what you do with it afterwards when the drug's worn off. But there's no taking away from the initial scream. That's what you go for. And Yoko makes a point here. It's especially for men. John, oh, poor men again. Yoko, because they never have the chance to cry, because they're always told not to cry or scream or show emotion like that. I wasn't very impressed with it. John says, she came along for the ride. I was the male who'd never cried, She could cry. My defences were so great. I mean, the cocky, chip on the shoulder, macho, aggressive, rock and roll hero who knew all the answers, and the smart quip, the sharp-talking king of the world, was actually a terrified guy who didn't know how to cry. Simple. Now I can cry. That's what I learned from Primal Therapy. We were there 6 months. We had a nice house in LA. We'd go down to the session, have a good cry, and come back and swim in the pool. And you'd always feel like after acid or a good joint, sort of in the pool, tingling, and everything was fine. But then your defences would all come up again. Like the acid would wear off, the joint would wear off, and you'd go back for another fix. Very interesting there. Really what he's expressing is his need, which I have as well, to almost escape the normal state. And that could come through various things. It could be drugs, it could be exercise, it could be therapy, But I think it's fairly well confirmed that people have been changing their consciousness or trying to change their consciousness almost since humans have existed. So it's not just exclusive to John Lennon. But yeah, interesting. I wonder then if he's started using the sessions like a drug, perhaps using it in that way, it becomes yet another crutch. Now, at this point, I'm going to play a little compilation of clips of Arthur Janov and his wife, Vivien, talking on a radio show in the 90s about John Lennon. I've used these clips separately, I think, but I'm going to put them all together just to give you, if you don't know much about Primal Therapy, give you a little bit of insight into that. So let's play those now.
I'm going to talk a little bit about what Primal Therapy is. It's gone into many incarnations over the years, but basically it means that we have needs that we're all born with, and that when those basic needs are not met, we hurt, and when that hurt is big enough, it's imprinted in the system, it changes our whole physiologic system. And then what our therapy does is go back to those early brains, the hurt brain, and relive the pain and get it out of the system. Because meanwhile, the pain is being held in storage and just waiting for its exit, so to speak. So Primal Therapy was a way of accessing our feeling brain and down below even the feeling brain into the brainstem to get to all the hurts that started very early in our lives and bring them up to the to consciousness for connection and integration.
What the therapy is about is releasing the tension and the repressed pain of early childhood. And that release comes about in the therapy through talking about your life, crying about the pain. And sometimes people do shout or scream, but I really try to get away from the idea of screaming because that's not the usual thing. People usually cry about pain.
It's the only place I had. That was mine. That was safe.
It's a very systematic therapy. It's paced by the patient. Now, the patient decides when he comes and when he leaves and how long he stays. There's no 50-minute hour anymore. And it's just the feelings of the patient determine when he stops. And what we found a way to do is to go back to those times and relive those pains and put them back into connection and integration in the system. When you have all those pains that are held in storage, as it were, it causes tension and anxiety and depression, all that kind of stuff. And so what we found a way to do is go little by little, step by step, down the ladder toward deep feeling and get it out of the system. What I think Primal Therapy is doing is different, is that instead of pushing back feelings with tranquilizers and drugs, we let the feelings up. It seems to me the most logical thing to do. So that instead of tranquilizing feelings, we're liberating them. And that's a big difference.
Through that release, people come to feeling very cleansed, very free, very knowledgeable about what really happened to them when they were children. In Primal Therapy, people actually relive the scenes, the painful scenes of their life, and have the emotions, the feelings expressed that they really didn't express when they were children. And that's the big difference, and that's what is so therapeutic. I think he did think, okay, the Maharishi disappointed me, now Janov is it. And I think Arthur may have represented to him the new brilliant father he never had. And part of Primal is to let people go inside themselves, to have a very deep internal experience. All of us have, a million kinds of defenses to protect ourselves. We have our morning paper, our cup of coffee, our telephone, our work, our music, our TV, our radio, our every kind of distraction that just keeps us moving all day. But if you know how it feels when you wake up at 4 a.m. and the pit of your stomach is aching a bit, you know the feeling of suddenly you are alone without your artifacts, so to speak. And that is what we try to create at the very beginning of therapy.
The interviewer says, "Do you still take that therapy?" John says, "Are you kidding? No, I'm not that stupid. The secret is to learn how to cry. Once you know how to do it, I don't believe all the garbage about going back and keep digging and digging and digging." The interviewer says, "Isn't it billed as an alternative to psychotherapy? I would never have gone to psychotherapy. I would never have gone if there hadn't been this promise of this scream, this liberating scream. And it was fantastic. Yoko never needed it. She did her own primal on stage. Yoko, and I wasn't looking for a daddy. I think Janov was a daddy for John. I think he has this father complex and he's always searching for a daddy." So Yoko explains that. It's something we've talked about a lot, and John Stewart also agreed with that. John says she fought with Janov all the time. He couldn't deal with it. Yoko, I'm not searching for the big daddy. I look for something else in men, something that is tender and weak, and I feel like I want to help. John says, yeah, and I'm the lucky cripple she chose. Yoko, I have this mother instinct, or whatever. Well, that's interesting, because earlier she kind of said that she was a bit of a quirky mother to Yoko. Again, there's a little bit too much glorification of Yoko for me, coming from John in these interviews. I think that was almost a complex he had, to be perfectly honest. That's the impression I feel. He had a mother complex as well as a father complex. Now, John expands that point. A lot of us are looking for fathers. Mine was physically not there. Most people's are not there mentally and physically, like always at the office or busy with other things. So all these leaders, parking meters, are all substitute fathers, whether they be religious or political. All this bit about electing a president, we pick our own daddy out of a dog pound of daddies. This is the daddy that looks like the daddy in the commercials. He's got the nice grey hair and the right teeth and the parting's on the right side. Okay? This is the daddy we choose. The dog pound of daddies, which is the political arena, gives us a president. Then we put him on a platform and start punishing him and screaming at him because daddy can't do miracles. Daddy doesn't heal us. We don't feel better. So then we move the daddy out in 4 years and we get a new daddy. And I mean, that sums up a lot of what I think about politics as well. I think we said that earlier, people looking for mummy and daddy, externally. And I don't blame fathers, I haven't got kids, so shouldn't judge. I think perhaps it's just the whole setup of modern society and the nuclear family. The nuclear family is not natural. It's a very, very new concept. And maybe it's just not enough when the father has to work. However nice he is, whatever good intention he has, maybe we do need substitutes. But I would still say, I'm not particularly religious, but salvation lies within. And I think you can do a lot of work on yourself, self-coaching you might call it, to not have the need for all these external things. And the whole thing he's saying about every 4 years, he's just summed up entertainment politics there. Then the interviewer says, so Janov was a daddy for you, who else? And Yoko says, before that there was Maharishi. John, Maharishi was a father figure. Elvis Presley might have been a father figure, I don't know. Robert Mitchum. Any male image is a father figure. There's nothing that's wrong with it until you give them the right to give you a sort of recipe for your life. What happens is somebody comes along with a good piece of truth. Instead of the truth being looked at, the person who brought it is looked at. It's like when bad news comes, they shoot the messenger. When the good news comes, they worship the messenger, and they don't listen to the message. Have you ever met a Christian who behaves like a Christian? Or in the other religions, have you met a person of the faith that behaves like the ideal? Well, nobody's perfect, right? Except for all these people who are named as being perfect. And then he talks about Janov. He accidentally discovered his thing. Before that, he was a straight Freudian psychologist. He finds this screaming by accident. Now he's writing theories, books, God knows what. If Janov's thing ever got as big as Christianity and then he died, they would be worshipping Janov. Not to take away from him, or whoever's system or method of learning to swim. The swimming's fine. It's with the Beatles too. The Beatles are not Jesus, and not Janov, and not Erhard. That's Werner Erhard. Maybe they had a nice way of swimming, but the swimming is the point. The records are the point, not the Beatles as individuals. Christ's package had the Virgin Mary and the miracles and going into the desert. Buddha had his whole package, but still the bare bones of the message is very similar to the Marxist message, whether it be Christianity, Mohammedanism, that's Islam I think, Buddhism, Confucianism, Marxism, Maoism. They're all about the person and not what the person said. Yoko says, all the isms are daddies. In my meetup group that I have in my local area here, there's a guy in the group who's very anti-religion and, he's anti, I should clarify that, he's anti-organised religion. And what it came down to, we were talking about Life of Brian, obviously the Monty Python film, financed by George Harrison. We were saying, yes, but those kind of people who worship Brian, they're just one type of Christian, but you would find them in any area of life. If you work in an office, there are certain people who will defy the boss. There are certain people who will respect the boss. And there are some people who just desperately need the boss because they need someone else to tell them how to live. And it doesn't always end badly for those people. Sometimes it goes well, I wanted to say, actually, when we were talking about therapy, would John Lennon have had therapy at any point? It sounds like he's pretty steadfast against not doing it. And I guess he thinks the answer lies within. But I really think that a therapist could have helped him because those childhood issues, they don't go away. In the posthumous book, Skywriting by Word of Mouth, which came out in the mid-80s, he was pretty scathing about therapy as well as Rubin and Hoffman and the Maharishi and almost everything else, in fact, except his family. I think, again, another thing we talked about with John, he's one of those people, he goes full bore, and when he decides that this is his thing, it's almost like everything else has to go out the window. As Paul said, he had to clear the space of the Beatles to give all his attention to Yoko. That was a very insightful thing from Paul. That was in episode 86, the one I put out at Christmas, 2 of us. Now we're changing tack a bit, and the interviewer says, what is the 80s dream to you, John? This is obviously September 1980. Well, you make your own dream. That's the Beatles story, isn't it? That's Yoko's story. That's what I'm saying now. Produce your own dream. If you want to save Peru, go save Peru. It's quite possible to do anything, but not if you put it on the leaders and the parking meters. This is getting a bit repetitive, isn't it? Sorry, folks. Don't expect Carter or Reagan or John Lennon or Yoko Ono or Bob Dylan or Jesus Christ to come and do it for you. You have to do it for yourself. The interview says, what is it that keeps people from accepting that message? It's fear of the unknown. The unknown is what it is, and to be frightened of it is what sends everybody scurrying around in circles, chasing dreams, illusions, wars, peace, love, hate, all that. It's all illusion. Unknown is what it is. Accept that it's unknown and it's plain sailing. Everything is unknown, then you're ahead of the game. That's what it is, right? So you're optimistic. I am, and I'm not the only one. Maybe the ones preaching the negative future get all the press, but there are others. Walk through the park and there are people holding hands and kissing. New York is beginning to look like Paris when I was younger, when I was 24 and people were holding hands and kissing under bridges. It's happening again. People are dreaming again. This is something I tend to say on Life and Life Only. If you follow the media on a daily basis and you base your view of the world around it, it's just an onslaught of bad news. The irony being that at the end of a TV news program, essentially they've given you all this bad news and they say, join us tomorrow for more bad news. That's not what they say, but that's essentially what they're asking you to do, which is pretty bizarre if you think about it. If you are feeling depressed and you just go out and you walk around your local park or whatever and you see people, you realise that people are decent. We can get frustrated that some people don't think for themselves enough, or they're looking for a leader or mummy or daddy or whatever. But then people are also decent. You know, I think it is true that 1 in every 100 people is a psychopath. And just to be clear, psychopath doesn't mean they're going to go out killing people. It means really a lack of empathy. So there are bad people out there and very, very misguided people. But I would still say the vast majority of people are decent people who are all struggling. Even the ones with lots of money, they're probably struggling a lot more than you think. If you think Elon Musk or Bezos or Bill Gates just wakes up full of the joys of life, why are they working so hard then? It can't only be for the good of the world, you know. There must be, I think, another reason. So just remember, folks, everybody is struggling. Don't envy people. In the book, though, they mention that on September the 29th, Newsweek magazine carried a 2-page interview with John and Yoko. So there's a little bit here about John saying, I hope you don't think we blew our jism with Newsweek, because I don't think we did. This is larger and better and deeper. It will be the reference book. The interviewer says, yes, you'll probably only have to do it once in your life. John says, yeah, in my life. It's interesting, isn't it, that if you read the whole book, John is often saying, oh, can you stop talking about the Beatles? But then he's chucking in these references. It's like so many other things. He has an ambivalent attitude to it. I'm sure he has an ambivalent attitude to therapy and the Maharishi and New Left politics. You know, he's always left wondering, I think. You know, he's always fighting these two sides of himself. Now we get into a bit that will interest a lot of Beatles fans. We get into a bit about writing. John and Paul writing. John had triggered the Beatles thing by saying, in my life, and then the interviewer ran with it. And John's like, oh, we're back down memory lane, are we? But sort of meaning it jokingly. How did you and Paul work together as composers? There are a lot of versions of what actually went on. So John says, well, take Michel, one of Paul's songs. He and I were staying somewhere and he walked in and hummed the first few bars with the words, you know. And he sings a bit of Michel. Where do I go from here? I've been listening to Nina Simone. I think it was I Put a Spell on You. There was a line in it that went, I love you, I love you, I love you. And that's what made me think of the middle eight for Michel. And then he sings the middle eight for Michel. So my contribution to Paul's songs was always to add a little bluesy edge to them. Otherwise, you know, Michel is a straight ballad, right? He provided a lightness and optimism, while I would always go for the sadness, the discords, the bluesy notes. There was a period when I thought I didn't write melodies, that Paul wrote those, and I just wrote straight shouting rock and roll. But of course, when I think of some of my own songs, In My Life or some of the early stuff, This Boy, I was writing melody with the best of them. Again, in episode 86, George Martin put it best. John thought of songs as words that needed melodies and music. Paul thought of them as music that needed words. George Martin stressed, however, that it wasn't 100% either way. And then the interviewer says, Paul had more musical training than you did, right? John, yeah, his father was a jazz musician. When I met him, he could play guitar, trumpet and piano. Doesn't mean to say he has a greater talent, but his musical education was better. I could only play the mouth organ and 2 chords on a guitar when we met. I tuned the guitar like a banjo, and then we get the stuff about Paul correcting the banjo chords into guitar chords. And this is interesting. So you didn't compose your stuff separately, as other accounts have said. No, I said that, but I was lying, laughs. By the time I said that, we were so sick of this idea of writing and singing together, especially me, that I started this thing about we never wrote together. We were never in the same room, which wasn't true. We wrote a lot of stuff together, one-on-one, eyeball to eyeball. Like in I Wanna Hold Your Hand. I remember when we got the chord that made the song. We were in Jane Asher's house downstairs in the cellar, playing on the piano at the same time, and we had, oh, you got that something. And Paul hits this chord, and I turn to him and say, that's it. I said, do that again. In those days, we really used to absolutely write like that, both playing into each other's noses. We spent hours and hours and hours. We wrote in the back of vans together. We wrote She Loves You in a van on the way to Newcastle, and From Me to You. Do you ever feel like you've missed him artistically? No, I mean, we worked together partly because the demand on us was tremendous. They'd want a record, a single, every 3 months, and we'd do it in 12 hours in a hotel or a van. So the cooperation was functional as well as musical. And I think Paul agreed with that in the Two of Us episode. He said, when touring stopped, that was the thing. John says, I always had an easier time with lyrics, although Paul is quite a capable lyricist who doesn't think he is, therefore he doesn't try. He would avoid the problem rather than face it. But in the early days, lyrics didn't really count as long as we had some vague theme. She loves you, he loves her, and they love each other. It was the hook and the line and the sound we were going for. That's still my attitude, but I can't leave lyrics alone. I have to make them make sense apart from the song. We get some stuff about Eleanor Rigby. Hardcore Beatles fans will know that Eleanor Rigby and In My Life are the two songs that John and Paul really mostly disagreed about. And I always had this fantasy, again, if John had lived, that one day they'd go back into a room and they'd play In My Life and Eleanor Rigby together and try and search their memory banks as they're playing them, maybe with two acoustics or an acoustic and a piano, and it would suddenly hit them. Oh yeah, I remember you did the middle eight. There is a bit later that you hear when John says that Paul did the middle to In My Life, and then he says, oh, maybe it wasn't In My Life, it was another song. So I think his memory is pretty fallible. And it's interesting, that thing about, he says, I did lie about us writing together. So then you go back to the Lennon Remembers interview, and you think, well, what else was he lying about? That's the thing. And with this one as well, obviously all the stuff about double fantasy coming to him through pure inspiration. If that's not true, then what else isn't true? But it's still endlessly fascinating to me anyway. And I hope you're enjoying this.
End of part 2.